At 8:16 in the morning on the 6th of August 1945, the control operator at Japan's National Broadcasting Corporation in Tokyo noticed something strange. The Hiroshima radio station had gone off the air. He tried to re-establish contact through another telephone line. That too had failed. 20 minutes later, the Tokyo Railroad Telegraph Center realized that the main line telegraph had stopped working just north of Hiroshima. From small railway stops within 10 miles of the city came confused, unofficial reports of something terrible. A blinding flash. A violent blast. Then nothing. All these reports were transmitted to the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. Military bases repeatedly tried to call the Army control station in Hiroshima. Complete silence. The General Staff was puzzled. They knew that no large enemy raid had occurred. Their radar had tracked only 3 B-29 bombers approaching. 3 aircraft could not have destroyed a city. And they knew that no sizable store of explosives was kept in Hiroshima that might have accidentally detonated. A young staff officer was instructed to fly immediately to Hiroshima, to land, survey the damage, and return to Tokyo with reliable information. As his aircraft approached, still nearly 100 miles from the city, he and his pilot saw something that defied explanation, a great cloud of smoke rising from a firestorm of unimaginable scale. They circled the ruins of what had been a city of 350,000 people. Below them was a burned wasteland stretching for miles in every direction. The officer landed south of the city and sent his report to Tokyo. But the full truth about what had destroyed Hiroshima did not come from that officer. It came 16 hours later from President Harry S. Truman's announcement broadcast from Washington to the world. And intercepted in Tokyo, the Americans had split the atom, and they had used it to erase Hiroshima from the map. This is the story of the 9 days that followed. 9 days of confusion, denial, bitter division, and a failed military coup. 9 days in which Japan's high command grappled with the unthinkable and came terrifyingly close to choosing national suicide over surrender. Transition. Historical context. To understand what happened in Tokyo after Hiroshima, you need to understand the men who controlled Japan's fate. They were called the Big Six, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. At their head sat Prime Minister Kanta Suzuki, a 77-year-old retired admiral, who was half-deaf and seemed, to many observers, to be sleepwalking through the apocalypse. Suzuki had survived an assassination attempt during a 1936 military uprising, taking multiple bullets. Some wondered if he had ever fully recovered. Beside him sat Foreign Minister Shigenori Tsugain, the closest thing Japan's government had to a peace advocate. Tsugain had opposed the war from the beginning and now desperately sought a way out. He was joined by Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who privately believed Japan was finished, but dared not say so openly. These 3 men, Suzuki and Yonai, represented what would become known as the peace faction. But they were evenly matched by 3 others. War Minister General Kurekika. Anami was the most powerful figure in Japan after the emperor himself. A former aide-de-camp to Emperor Hirohito, Anami commanded absolute loyalty from the Imperial Army. He was a true samurai, devoted to the warrior code of Bushido, and he would rather see Japan destroyed than see it surrender in dishonor. Standing with Anami were the chiefs of staff of both armed services, General Yoshi Jieremezu of the Army and Admiral Somu Toyoda of the Navy. Together, these 3 hawks controlled Japan's military and believed utterly in what they called ketsu, cooperation decisive. The plan was simple and apocalyptic. When the Americans invaded the Japanese home islands, as everyone knew they would, Japan would throw everything it had at them. Every soldier, every civilian, every man, woman and child would fight with sharpened bamboo spears if necessary. The Imperial Army had stockpiled over 10,000 kamikaze aircraft. They would turn the beaches of Kyushu into an ocean of American blood. And then, surely, the Americans would offer better terms. This was the mindset the atomic bomb would have to break. And in the first critical hours after Hiroshima, it did not seem to be working. Section 3. It can only be an atomic bomb transition. The investigation on the 7th of August, the day after Hiroshima was destroyed, Japan's leading nuclear physicist arrived in the ruined city. Dr. Yoshio Nishina was the father of modern physics in Japan. He had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, worked alongside Werner Heisenberg, and was friends with many of the scientists who had built the American bomb, though he did not know that then. During the war, Nishina had led Japan's own secret atomic bomb project, though it had never come close to producing a weapon. When Nishina had received a copy of Truman's announcement through restricted channels, he knew immediately what had happened. He went to the office of the chief cabinet secretary and said, in a trembling voice, "It can only be an atomic bomb to cause such havoc. We scientists must apologize to the nation for our incompetence." Now he was on the ground in Hiroshima with a team of 30 scientists, army doctors, and engineers, led by Army Lieutenant General Seizo Arijo. Looking down from their aircraft at the scorched desert below, Nishina felt the weight of terrible certainty. This was indeed the work of a nuclear bomb, but he needed proof. Hard empirical proof that even the military hardliners in Tokyo could not dismiss. Without Geiger, Muller tubes, or specialized detection equipment, Nishina had to improvise. He asked the local army command to provide bodies of bomb victims for autopsy. Specifically, people who had died without visible wounds, who had succumbed to something invisible. What he found was devastating. The internal organs looked as though they had been scoured with a wire brush. Every small passage was clogged with blood. Bone marrow had been destroyed at the cellular level. The gamma rays and neutrons released by the bomb had shredded human tissue from the inside out. Does everyone see this? Nishina asked his gathered team of scientists and military observers. Make no mistake, this is internal organ destruction caused by an atomic bomb. On the 8th of August, Nishina wired his confirmation back to Tokyo. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a nuclear weapon. The official report stated, "This bomb was neither dynamite nor an incendiary weapon. It has been clearly identified as an atomic bomb." But even scientific proof would not be enough to move Japan's high command. Section 4. Denial and deadlock transition. Political reaction. When Foreign Minister Tugul learned of the atomic bombing from news agency reports, on the 6th of August, he immediately recognized the opportunity. This was Japan's chance to end the war with some shred of national honor. The defeat had not come from the hated Soviet Union or from an American invasion. It had come from a superweapon that no nation could have withstood. Ku advised the cabinet that Japan should accept the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender, immediately before the Americans dropped more atomic bombs. He was overruled. War Minister Anami dismissed the American atomic announcement as propaganda. Even after reviewing the initial reports from Hiroshima, he insisted that the United States probably possessed only one such weapon. "I am convinced that the Americans had only one bomb after all," he declared. Prime Minister Suzuki, old and tired, acquiesced to the hardliners. He told the press that the government would mokusatsu, literally kill with silence, the Potsdam Declaration. Japan would continue fighting. The Supreme Council for the direction of the war was supposed to meet to discuss Japan's response to the atomic bomb. But incredibly, the meeting was delayed. Some military leaders had prior commitments. The official excuse read, "For 3 full days after Hiroshima was destroyed, the Big Six did not convene." This delay, which one historian has called criminal, revealed a disturbing truth. The destruction of Hiroshima had not fundamentally altered the calculus for Japan's military leaders. In their minds, one more city had died in a country that had already seen 64 cities reduced to ashes by conventional firebombing. Tokyo itself had burned in March, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. What was Hiroshima but one more fire? The hardliners remained convinced that Ketsu-go would work. The Americans would still have to invade. The beaches of Kyushu would still run red with American blood. And then Japan would negotiate from strength. They were about to receive two devastating blows that would shatter that illusion forever. Section 5. The Twin Shocks Transition. The 9th of August, 1945, at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of August, word reached Tokyo that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. Stalin had broken the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact with exactly the kind of treachery the Japanese had practiced at Pearl Harbor. Soviet armies were pouring into Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces that had been stripped of their best troops to defend the homeland. The diplomatic fantasy of Soviet mediation, the last hope Japan's leaders had clung to, was dead. Emperor Hirohito summoned his closest advisor, Marquis Kido, and told him, "The Soviet Union has declared war and today began hostilities against us. Quickly control the situation." At 10:30 that morning, the Supreme Council finally met to discuss Hiroshima and the Soviet invasion. For the first time, they were actually debating the terms on which Japan might end the war. Foreign Minister Taji proposed accepting the Potsdam Declaration with a single condition: that the Allies preserve the institution of the emperor, the kokutai, the sacred national polity that defined Japan's identity. General Anami and the military chiefs demanded 3 additional conditions. Japan would disarm its own forces, Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, and there would be no Allied occupation of the Japanese home islands. The council was split 3-3. Deadlock. Then, shortly after 11 o'clock, a messenger arrived. He bowed low and brought news that a second atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. The Big Six paused, acknowledged the news, and resumed their argument about the Soviet invasion. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, had barely scratched the surface of Tokyo's glacial deliberations. One official Japanese military history would later note that no record treated the effect of the Nagasaki bomb seriously. To the hardliners, it simply confirmed that the Americans had more than one bomb. But it did not change the fundamental calculation, or so they believed. What the hardliners did not grasp, what Suzuki would only admit months later, was the strategic significance of the second bomb. If the Americans had an arsenal of atomic weapons, they no longer needed to invade Japan. They could simply keep destroying cities until nothing remained. The entire logic of Ketsu-go was bankrupt. There would be no beaches to defend. There would be no negotiation. There would only be extinction. The cabinet debated all day and into the night. Still no consensus. At 6 o'clock in the evening, they met again. At 10 o'clock, they were still arguing. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., Prime Minister Suzuki did something unprecedented. He requested an imperial conference, a meeting in the presence of the emperor himself, at which Hirohito would be asked to break the deadlock. Japan's fate would be decided in a concrete bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. Section 6. The Sacred Decision Transition. The Imperial Conference. The meeting began just before midnight on the night of the 9th of August -10, in an underground air raid shelter beneath the palace. The room was small and swelteringly hot. The participants sat in formal dress, glistening with sweat. On and by one, the members of the Supreme Council restated their positions. Baron Kiichir Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council, outlined Japan's desperate situation, the food shortage, the destruction of industry, the impossibility of defending against atomic attack. Then the military hardliners spoke, insisting that the 4 conditions must be met, or Japan must fight to the death. General Anami's voice filled the bunker with terrible conviction. We should live up to our cause, even if our 100 million people have to die. I am sure we are well prepared for a decisive battle on our mainland, even against the United States. Chief of Staff Umezu agreed. Although the Soviet entry into the war is disadvantageous, we are still not in a situation where we should be forced to agree to unconditional surrender. The debate went on. Midnight passed. It was now the 10th of August. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Prime Minister Suzuki finally approached the emperor and did what no Japanese prime minister had ever done before. He asked the emperor to decide. In the Japanese system of government, the emperor was supposed to sanction decisions made by the cabinet, not make them himself. he was a god above human politics. For Hirohito to express a preference was to cross a line that had not been crossed in centuries. But there was no other way. Emperor Hirohito spoke. His voice was soft, high-pitched, trembling with emotion. He said that continuing the war could only result in the total destruction of Japan. He said that the time had come to bear the unbearable. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, he told his stunned ministers, and have concluded that continuing the war means destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people struggle any longer. He mentioned the atomic bomb specifically. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. The emperor supported the peace faction's position. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: preservation of the imperial institution. When Hirohito finished speaking, several of the ministers were openly weeping. General Anami sat rigid, his face a mask. He had devoted his life to the emperor. He could not defy his sovereign's will. But others would try. Section 7. The coup transition. The coup transition. The Kochijai incident. Not everyone was prepared to accept surrender, even when commanded by a living god. In the days that followed the Imperial Conference, as Japan's diplomatic message was transmitted to the Allies, and as the world waited for their response, a conspiracy took shape in the corridors of the War Ministry. Major Kenji Hatanaka was a 32-year-old staff officer who could not imagine laying down arms while an enemy still stood. Along with Lieutenant Colonel Shizaki and other officers, he planned a coup d'etat that would seize the imperial palace, place the emperor under protective custody, and destroy the recording of the surrender announcement that Hirohito was scheduled to deliver. On the 14th of August, after the Allies' response had been received, demanding that the emperor be subject to the Allied Supreme Commander, the hardliners made one last attempt to reject surrender. They were overruled. Hirohito declared that he was satisfied with the Allied terms. Japan would surrender unconditionally. That evening, the emperor entered a soundproof bunker beneath the palace and recorded his surrender speech for broadcast the following day. The recording was 4 minutes and 45 seconds long. It would be the first time common Japanese had ever heard the voice of their emperor. 2 copies were pressed onto phonograph records and hidden in a safe beneath the palace. Shortly before midnight on the 14th of August, Hatanaka and his confederates put their plan into action. They went to Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guards, and demanded his support for the coup. Mori refused. Hatanaka shot him dead. The conspirators then forged an order in Mori's name, using his official seal, and sent soldiers of the Imperial Guard to occupy the palace. Phone lines were cut, the grounds were sealed. 1,000 officers and soldiers participated in what the Japanese would later call the Kochi-jiken, the palace incident. Through the long night, Hatanaka's men searched frantically for the emperor's recording. They ransacked offices, interrogated palace staff, threatened and imprisoned anyone who might know where the records were hidden. But they could not find them. Meanwhile, other conspirators attempted to assassinate Prime Minister Suzuki at his residence. He escaped moments before they arrived, fleeing through a back entrance as bullets shattered his windows. The coup was bold, but it lacked the one thing it needed: support from senior military commanders. When General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern Army, learned what was happening, he made clear that he would crush the uprising. Without him, the rebels had no chance. By 8 o'clock on the morning of the 15th of August, loyal troops surrounded the palace. The rebellion was over. Hatanaka and Shizaki, knowing they had failed, rode through the streets of Tokyo on a motorcycle and horseback, throwing leaflets that explained their actions. Then, shortly before noon, with the emperor's broadcast only minutes away, both men took their own lives. Hatanaka put a pistol to his forehead. In his pocket was his death poem. I have nothing to regret now that the dark clouds have disappeared from the reign of the emperor. Section 8. The Voice from Heaven Transition. The 15th of August, 1945. At precisely noon on the 15th of August, 1945, All NHK radio stations across Japan instructed the nation to stand for an announcement of the highest importance. The national anthem played. Then came a voice that no common Japanese person had ever heard before. It was the voice of a god. Emperor Hirohito spoke in a formal, archaic Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand. He did not use the word surrender. Instead, with extraordinary understatement, he announced that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He referenced the atomic bombs directly. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. To avoid this catastrophe, he said, Japan must bear the unbearable. Across the nation, people wept. Many knelt in the streets. Some did not understand what the emperor had said and had to wait for an announcer's clarification that followed the broadcast. Japan had surrendered. In Tokyo, as the recording played, one man was already dying. General Kurekika Anami, the war minister who had fought so fiercely against surrender, had been awake all night. In the early hours of the 15th of August, he had changed into his dress uniform and sat down with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko. I am thinking of seppuku tonight, Anami said quietly. Takeshita asked why it had to be that night. I decided on tonight, Anami replied. Because it is the 14th anniversary of my father's death, and I cannot bear to live through the Emperor's surrender broadcast. At around 5:30 in the morning, Anami knelt on a dais in the traditional manner and took up a dagger. He plunged the blade into his stomach and drew it across, eviscerating himself in the ancient ritual of harakiri. The wound was not immediately fatal. For hours, he lay bleeding as life slowly left him. Finally, a staff officer ordered a military physician to administer a lethal injection to end his suffering. Anami left behind a suicide note that read, I with my death humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime. Historians have debated ever since what crime he meant. Was it Japan's defeat, his own failure to prevent the war, or something else? Perhaps his secret relief that the killing was finally over. Vice Admiral Takijie Tanishi, the man who had invented kamikaze tactics, also committed seppuku that day. His note was addressed to the spirits of the young pilots he had sent to their deaths. With my death, I desire to make atonement to the souls of the kamikaze pilots and their families. Scores of other officers followed their example in the days that followed. Section 9. Aftermath Transition. Reflections. The formal instruments of surrender was signed on the 2nd of September, 1945. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur presided as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. Emperor Hirohito remained on his throne, his divinity officially renounced on New Year's Day 1946. Looking back on those 9 days between Hiroshima and surrender, what lessons can we draw? First, the atomic bomb did not produce immediate surrender. 3 full days passed before Japan's leaders even met to discuss it. The military hardliners initially dismissed it as propaganda, or, at best, a one-time weapon. Even the destruction of Nagasaki barely registered in their debates. Second, what finally broke the deadlock was not the bomb alone, but the bomb combined with the Soviet invasion. Together, these twin shocks destroyed the last hopes of the hardliners. The Soviet entry eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace through Moscow. The second atomic bomb eliminated any hope that Ketsu-go would force the Americans to negotiate. There would be no invasion to resist. Third, even after the emperor himself commanded surrender, fanatical officers nearly succeeded in preventing it. The Kojije incident came terrifyingly close to seizing the palace, destroying the surrender recording, and plunging Japan back into suicidal war. And finally, what ultimately ended the war was neither bombs nor invasions. but the personal intervention of one man, Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of tradition to impose his will on a government that could not agree. The hardliners had been prepared to sacrifice millions of Japanese lives rather than accept the dishonor of surrender. War Minister Anami had said that Japan should live up to our cause, even if our 100 million people have to die. This was not hyperbole. This was military policy. The atomic bombs gave the peace faction the opening they needed. As Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakamizu later said, the bombing was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. The bomb provided an excuse that preserved Japanese honor. They had not been defeated by conventional military power, but by a superweapon against which no defense was possible. But this golden opportunity required one thing more: an emperor willing to speak. Section 10. The unanswered question. Closing. Philosophical reflection. We are left with a haunting question. What if Hirohito had not spoken? What if the Supreme Council had remained deadlocked? What if Anami and the hardliners had prevailed? What if the coup had succeeded? The United States had a third atomic bomb nearly ready, scheduled for deployment around the 19th of August. A fourth would have followed in September, then more after that. Plans were already underway for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled to begin in November 1945. Military planners estimated American casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, were projected in the millions. The war would not have ended differently. It would only have ended later, at a cost in human life that defies comprehension. In the end, Japan's surrender came down to a single voice in a concrete bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. A voice saying that enough was enough, that bearing the unbearable was better than embracing extinction. It was the voice of a god telling his people that even gods must sometimes bend. End title card. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima and killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to 140,000. 3 days later, a second bomb killed 40,000 in Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito remained on his throne until his death in 1989, the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only nuclear weapons ever used in warfare.